The first sign of the nightmare was the silence, a profound and heavy quiet that swallowed the usual sounds of a late December evening. The wind, which had howled all day like a famished wolf, suddenly held its breath. The groaning of the old farmhouse timbers ceased. Even the frantic scratching of the mice in the walls, a constant, irritating companion through the long winter nights, had gone still. I sat by the fire, a half-empty mug of mulled wine growing cold in my hands, and felt a dread as cold and as sharp as an icicle press against the base of my skull. It was a preternatural stillness, the kind that precedes not a storm, but something far worse, something that walks in the storm's wake. The world outside my frost-laced window panes seemed to have been erased, plunged into an abyss of snow and shadow, and the silence was the sound of that abyss staring back. My dog, a usually unflappable golden retriever named Buster, was a statue of tawny fur by the hearth, his head cocked, a low, guttural growl vibrating deep in his chest. He wasn't looking at the door or the windows, but at the chimney, as if he heard something I couldn't, something slithering down through the soot-blackened bricks. The stories were as old as the hills that cradled this isolated valley, whispered fireside stories to frighten children and chasten adults during the longest nights of the year. They spoke of the Yule Time Witch, a creature born of winter's cruelest heart, known in the old tongue as Grýla. She wasn't the wart-nosed crone of fairy tales, but something elemental and ancient, a being of frost and famine. The legends claimed she slumbered for most of the year in a cave of glacial ice, but awoke during the Yuletide, driven by an insatiable hunger. She didn't ride a broomstick, but was carried on the north wind itself, her hair a blizzard, her eyes chips of frozen moonlight. Her purpose was singular, to hunt, not for deer or for rabbits, but for the wicked, the misbehaving, and sometimes simply the unlucky. They said you could hear her coming by the sudden, unnatural hush that fell upon the land, and by the faint, rhythmic scraping sound, like bone dragging on stone. That was the sound of her impossibly long fingernails testing the roofs of houses, searching for a way in. The fire in my hearth sputtered, casting dancing, distorted shadows that looked like grasping claws on the opposite wall. The low growl in Buster's chest deepened, and I knew, with a certainty that defied all modern reason, that the whispers were not just stories. An odor, thin and sharp, seeped into the room, worming its way through the scent of pine and cinnamon. It was the smell of a winter thaw, of damp earth and rotting leaves, but underneath it was something else, something metallic and foul, like a slaughterhouse in the dead of winter. It was the scent of pure evil, an ancient and patient malevolence that had seen empires rise and fall and had outlasted them all. This wasn't the chaotic evil of human depravity. It was something colder, more calculating. It was the indifferent evil of the spider that weaves its web, the wolf that stalks the lamb. It was the evil of the hunger that gnaws and is never satisfied. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the suffocating silence. The air grew frigid, the warmth from the fire seemingly sucked up the chimney as if by a great and thirsty mouth. Buster let out a sharp, terrified yelp and scrambled backward, his claws scrabbling on the wooden floorboards, his eyes still fixed on the hearth. The shadows on the wall no longer looked like claws. They were coalescing, darkening, taking on a form that was tall and stooped, and horribly, unnaturally thin. The horror began not with a scream, but with a trickle of soot, a fine black dust that rained down from the flue and settled on the embers, hissing softly. Then came another, larger clump, followed by a shower of brick dust and mortar. A scraping sound echoed from within the chimney, a dry, rasping noise that spoke of immense weight being dragged through a space far too small to contain it. It was the sound of a snake shedding its skin, of a body contorting itself into impossible shapes. The fire dwindled to a few terrified-looking coals, their orange glow a feeble defiance against the encroaching cold and dark. I was frozen in my chair, a primal fear cementing my limbs in place. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to run, to grab the antique shotgun mounted over the mantelpiece, to do something, anything. But my body wouldn't obey. I could only watch, a spectator at my own impending doom, as the thing in the chimney continued its grotesque descent. The scraping grew louder, closer, punctuated by a wet, popping sound, like a joint being dislocated. The bloodshed was what the old stories always lingered on, described in gruesome, cautionary detail. Grýla did not kill cleanly. Her hunger was not merely for flesh, but for terror, for the suffering that seasoned her meals. The legends told of farmsteads found silent and snow-covered on Christmas morning, the doors ajar, the interiors a whirlwind of destruction. They spoke of trails of blood leading from beds and into the woods, only to vanish as if the victim had been snatched up into the sky. Her methods were cruel and varied, a winter harvest of pain. Some tales described her impossibly long, iron-like fingernails, sharp enough to flense a man to the bone in seconds. Others spoke of her teeth, not individual points, but serrated ridges of rock like the inside of a shark's mouth, used for grinding bone to marrow. The blood was not just a byproduct of her feeding. It was a sacrament to her ancient wintry god. She painted the snow with it, a crimson offering under the pale light of the solstice moon, a stark and brutal reminder that even during a season of light and hope, the darkness held its own terrible celebrations. The source of this evil was a subject of much debate in the folklore. Some said she was a fallen goddess of the harvest, cursed to embody the famine and frost that followed the bounty. Others claimed she was the first murderer's mother, condemned to wander the frozen wastes, her hunger for her lost child, twisted into a hunger for all children. But the oldest, darkest tales whispered that she was neither of these things. She was simply what she was. An entity that had existed long before humanity had kindled its first fire, a physical manifestation of the cold, predatory indifference of the cosmos. She was the shiver that runs down your spine when you are alone in the woods at night, the sudden, irrational fear of the dark corner in your own home. She was the personification of the void that waits at the end of all things, giving teeth and claws and an eternal, gnawing appetite. The cold in the room was now so intense I could see my own breath fogging in front of my face. The scraping from the chimney stopped. For a heart-stopping moment, the only sound was the frantic pounding of my own blood in my ears. Then a single skeletal hand, long and gray as a dead branch, emerged from the fireplace. Its fingers were impossibly long, jointed like a spider's legs, and tipped with what looked like shards of obsidian. The hand twitched, then flattened itself against the soot-stained brick, and another one followed. The air was thick with that graveyard smell, a stench of cold meat and damp soil that made my stomach heave. The creature was creepy in a way that defied description, its form an offense to the natural order. It unfolded itself from the hearth with a series of sickening cracks and pops, rising to its full, terrifying height. It was gaunt, a skeleton draped in gray, leathery skin, and impossibly tall, its head brushing the ceiling beams. Its face was a landscape of shadows, with two burning points of pale, cold light where its eyes should be. It wore rags that might have once been clothes, now little more than frozen tatters clinging to its skeletal frame. Its mouth opened, a black, cavernous hole, and a sound came out, not a roar, but a low, guttural clicking, like stones rubbing together in a deep, frozen river. This was the fate of her victims. Not just to be killed, but to be unmade, to be consumed by a force that saw them as nothing more than sustenance. In that moment, I understood the true terror of the legends. It wasn't just the fear of death, but the fear of annihilation, of being reduced to a mere anecdote in a ghost story, a blood stain on the snow. Buster, finally breaking free from his fear, launched himself at the creature, a blur of golden fur and righteous fury. He was no match for it. The witch swatted him aside with a casual flick of its long arm, sending him crashing into the far wall with a sickening thud. He lay still. A rage, hot and pure, finally burned through the ice of my fear. I wasn't just a potential meal anymore. I was the last line of defense for my home, for the memory of my loyal friend. The thing's gaze, those 2 points of burning frost, settled on me. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, its bare, skeletal feet making no sound on the wooden floor. I looked past it, at the shotgun over the mantel. It was a lifetime away. The Folklore was not just a collection of scary stories. It was a survival manual, a codex of desperate measures passed down through generations. They said Grýla feared fire, the one thing that could hold the winter at bay. They said she was bound by certain rules, ancient laws of hospitality and threshold. But above all, they said her greatest weakness was the coming of the dawn, the promise of the sun's return. The light was anathema to her, a searing purity that could unmake her ancient shadowy form. My eyes darted to the window. Outside, the world was still a maelstrom of black and white, the night absolute and supreme. Dawn was hours away. There would be no salvation from the sun for me. But there was one other detail, a strange and often forgotten piece of the lore. They said that Grýla, for all her power, could be distracted, even momentarily fascinated, by a well-told story. It was a fool's hope, a threadbare chance, but it was all I had left. The creature loomed over me, its foul breath a winter fog on my face. Its cavernous mouth opened, the clicking sound growing louder, a prelude to the final tearing bite. I closed my eyes, not in resignation, but to focus, to draw on every ounce of strength I had left. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I opened my mouth, and with a voice that shook but did not break, I began to speak. Once upon a time, I said, the words ridiculously inadequate, in a valley surrounded by mountains older than memory, there lived a man who was not afraid of the dark. The clicking sound faltered. The 2 burning eyes seemed to narrow, a flicker of something that might have been curiosity in their cold depths. I kept talking, weaving a tale of light and courage, of a hero who faced down a monster, not with a sword, but with a song. I poured every bit of my hope, my despair, and my defiance into the story, my voice the only sound in the frozen room. I didn't know if it would be enough to save me, if this last, desperate act could hold the ancient evil at bay. But as the Yule Time Witch paused, its head cocked as if listening to a long-forgotten melody, I continued to speak, my words a tiny, flickering flame against the all-consuming hungry dark. They say I was lucky to get away. I say I just bought time. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spooky stories.